The moment my future father-in-law started explaining to me how emergency medicine actually works, I made a decision. I wasn't going to say a word. Not yet. I just sat there at his kitchen table, cutting into the pot roast his wife had spent all afternoon making, nodding politely while he told me, a board-certified emergency physician with 11 years in level I trauma centers, that the real problem with modern ER doctors is that they don't listen to patients. I smiled. I said, I reached for the breadbasket. My fiancé caught my eye from across the table and gave me this tiny, desperate look that said, please don't. So I didn't. I let his father keep talking. Let me back up. My name is Simone and I am 32 years old. I've been an emergency physician at St. Aurelius Medical Center in Phoenix for 4 years. Before that, I did my residency at a hospital in Baltimore that sees some of the highest trauma volume on the East Coast. I've worked overnight shifts on New Year's Eve. I've been in the room when things go wrong in ways that don't get talked about at dinner parties. And I have, on more than one occasion, made a call that kept someone alive long enough for their family to say goodbye. I don't say any of this to sound impressive. I say it because you need to understand what it felt like to sit across from my fiancé's father, a man I was meeting for the first time, and hear him lecture me about my own field like I was a nursing student who'd gotten lost on the way to clinicals. My fiancé's name is Theo. We met 3 years ago at a friend's housewarming party in Tempe. He's a high school history teacher, which I love about him. He's patient in a way that I'm not always able to be. He remembers everyone's birthday, and he makes the best breakfast food I have ever eaten in my life. We got engaged 6 months ago on a hiking trail outside Sedona, and I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. His family is in Tucson. His dad, Ray, spent 22 years as a paramedic before retiring. His mom, Linda, teaches piano lessons out of their home. Theo has a younger sister, Bree, who just started her sophomore year of college. From everything Theo had told me, they were warm, close-knit, a little old-fashioned, in the way that some families from that part of Arizona are. Nothing I couldn't handle. The issue, and I want to be fair to Theo here, even though I was furious with him for weeks about this, is that he had never exactly told his father what I do for a living. Not a lie. He'd just been vague about it. She's in medicine was apparently the extent of it. When I asked him why, he got quiet and said his dad had strong opinions about emergency physicians specifically. There had been some incident years ago. A family friend who'd felt dismissed in an ER waiting room during a cardiac event. Ray had never quite let it go. Theo thought if his dad got to know me first, as a person, before knowing what I did, everything would go smoothly. I should have pushed back harder on that plan. We drove down on a Saturday in March. Linda had made pot roast and a green bean casserole and 2 kinds of pie. The house smelled like cinnamon and warmth and genuinely good intentions. Bree immediately pulled me into a hug and asked if I wanted to see the family's old photo albums, which is the kind of thing that makes you feel immediately welcome. Ray shook my hand. He had a firm handshake, square jaw, eyes that assessed you in about 3 seconds. He seemed fine. Friendly, even. We sat down to eat. It started innocuously enough. Ray asked about Phoenix, asked about the neighborhood Theo and I live in, asked if we'd thought about buying something before prices went up any further. Normal stuff. I liked him, actually, in those first 20 minutes. He was direct and he was funny, and you could see where Theo got his patience from. Then the topic shifted to healthcare, and something changed in him. He started with the general stuff, insurance, wait times, how the whole system had become one big bureaucratic disaster. I agreed with him on some of it. Any physician who's spent time in an emergency department has thoughts about insurance and wait times. I said as much, keeping it brief, keeping it casual. And that's when he looked at me and said with absolute confidence, the problem is the doctors, the ER doctors especially. No offense to people in medicine generally, but those guys think they know everything, and they stop listening. I paused with my fork halfway to my mouth. Tell me more about that, I said. which is a thing I say when I'm trying to understand where someone is coming from before I respond. In the ER, we call it getting the full history. Ray was happy to elaborate. He told me about his years as a paramedic. 22 years, he said, and he'd seen things. He brought patients into ERs and watched attending physicians dismiss his field assessments. He'd seen nurses and paramedics, the people actually in the field, get talked over by doctors who'd never left the building. He said the problem with emergency medicine specifically was that the training had become too academic, too focused on protocol, not focused enough on instinct and experience. I nodded. Linda refilled my water glass. Theo was looking at the green bean casserole with the focus of a man trying to escape his own body. You know what I always say, Ray continued. Give me a good paramedic over an ER doctor any day. A paramedic who's seen things, who's been in the field, not someone who's been sitting in a hospital reading charts. That's a really interesting perspective, I said. And I meant it, actually. It is an interesting perspective. It is also not entirely accurate, but it comes from somewhere real, from a genuine frustration that exists in the EMS community. And I have respect for that frustration even when the conclusion lands wrong. What I did not say, that most emergency physicians I know genuinely revere paramedics, that our jobs are different, not hierarchical, that I personally have leaned on paramedic field assessments dozens of times because those are the people who saw what the patient looked like before they hit the doors, that the idea of an ER doctor who doesn't listen to EMS is not a good ER doctor. I didn't say any of that, because Theo had asked me not to make it a thing, and because Linda had worked hard on that pot roast, and because Bree was telling a very sweet story about her roommate's cat. So I said, I think the relationship between EMS and emergency medicine is complicated, and left it there. Ray looked at me with something that wasn't quite condescension, but was adjacent to it. The look you give someone who said something technically correct, but clearly doesn't have the depth to understand the real issue. Do you have family in medicine? He asked. Not really, I said. My mom's a librarian. Dad's retired from the post office. He nodded, like that explained something. What is it you said you do? He asked. And here was the moment, right here, where I could have just told him. I could have said it simply and cleanly, and we could have had an entirely different rest of the evening. Instead, I looked at Theo. Theo looked at his plate. I work in a hospital, I said. Administration? Ray asked. Something like that, I said. And I have replayed that sentence in my head approximately 400 times since then because it was the wrong answer. And I knew it was the wrong answer in the moment I said it. And I said it anyway because I was trying to protect my fiancé's feelings in a situation that his avoidance had created. Ray visibly relaxed. That makes sense, he said. The administrative side is, well, there are good people there. It's just not the same as being on the ground. No, I agreed. It's really not. Dinner continued. The pie was excellent. Linda made a sour cherry and a pecan, and I had a slice of each because I have never seen a reason to have principles about pie. Bree showed me pictures of her campus. Theo and his dad talked about some home project Ray was working on. It was a genuinely pleasant evening, all things considered. But on the drive home, I told Theo we needed to talk. I wasn't yelling. I don't really yell, but I was clear. I told him that what had happened at dinner wasn't something I was willing to repeat, that going into his family as someone in hospital administration was not a long-term plan, that I understood his reasoning, but his dad's opinions about my field did not actually change what I do or who I am, and I was not going to spend the next 40 years pretending to be something smaller, so his father was more comfortable. Theo was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You're right. I'm sorry. I didn't handle it well." Which is one of the things I love about him. He doesn't get defensive. He just absorbs it and acknowledges it. We talked for another hour after we got home, and by the end of it, we had an actual plan. The next time I saw Ray, Theo would introduce me properly, and if his dad had feelings about it, we'd work through them. What we did not plan for was the way it actually happened. 3 weeks later, I was on shift. Tuesday, late afternoon, the kind of day where the cases are steady but not overwhelming. A dislocated shoulder, a kid with croup, a woman in her 60s with a UTI that had been misread as back pain at an urgent care. I was mid-chart when one of our nurses, Priya, knocked on the doorframe and said there was a walk-in with chest pain. 63-year-old male, said he'd driven himself in because he didn't want to make a fuss. I almost laughed. They never want to make a fuss. That's usually when you start paying closer attention. I walked around the curtain. Ray was sitting on the edge of the exam table in his street clothes, one hand pressed to his sternum, looking, and this is the only word for it, annoyed. Annoyed at his own chest, like his heart was being inconvenient. He saw me. I saw him. There was a pause that lasted maybe 2 seconds and felt significantly longer. "Simone," he said. "Hi," I said. "Can you tell me when the pain started?" He blinked. "You work here." "I do. When did the pain start?" He stared at me for another moment, and I could see him recalibrating, going back through the dinner conversation, doing the math. And then something shifted in his face. Not embarrassment yet. Something more like the professional recognition that kicks in when you've been in emergency situations long enough. He knew where he was. He knew what I was. "About 40 minutes ago," he said. "Substernal, radiates to the left shoulder. I took an aspirin before I came in." Good instinct on the aspirin. I told him so. I did his intake, ordered the EKG, ordered troponin and a BMP, got him on a monitor. The EKG showed changes I didn't love. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to keep him. I paged cardiology. I came back in and explained what I was seeing in terms that he would understand, because he had 22 years of emergency medicine on the other side of the gurney, and he deserved that. He listened. He asked good questions. He was, it turned out, an excellent patient, which makes sense, because people who worked in emergency services tend to understand what's happening around them and don't waste time arguing with the process. His wife arrived about 40 minutes after I admitted him. Linda walked in with her coat half on and her reading glasses still on top of her head, and when she saw me standing next to Ray's bed with a stethoscope around my neck, she stopped walking. "Oh," she said. "Hi, Linda," I said. "He's stable. I've got cardiology coming down. His troponin was mildly elevated, so we're going to keep him overnight for observation, but his pressure is good and he's been comfortable." She sat down next to him and took his hand and didn't say much for a minute. Then she looked at me and said, "Theo never told us." "No," I said, "he didn't." Ray was looking at the ceiling. "She knew what I said at dinner," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes." He was quiet. I finished checking his monitor readings, updated the chart, gave Priya the rundown for the shift handoff since I was coming up on hour 11. Before I left the room, Ray said my name. I turned around. He looked like a man who was working something out, something that had more to do with himself than with his heart. "How long?" he asked. "Emergency medicine." 11 years total," I said. 4 here." He nodded slowly. "You're good," he said. "At this, the way you explained things without talking down. You ordered everything in the right sequence." He paused. "I know what good looks like. I've been in enough ERs." "I know you have," I said. Another pause. "I owe you an apology," he said, "from dinner." "You didn't know." "That's not really an excuse, is it?" he said. "It wasn't a question either." "I've thought about it. I thought about the pot roast and the 2 kinds of pie and the way he'd said, 'Give me a good paramedic over an ER doctor any day with such complete confidence.' And I thought about all the women I know in emergency medicine who have sat across from men like Ray, not bad men, not cruel men, just certain men, and absorbed that certainty in silence because the situation called for it. No, I said, it's not really an excuse, but it's a place to start. He was in the hospital for 2 nights. Cardiology determined it was an NSTEMI, a non-ST elevation myocardial infarction, a heart attack, the kind that doesn't always announce itself loudly. He had a stent placed the following morning and was discharged on Wednesday afternoon with a medication regimen and a follow-up appointment and a list of lifestyle adjustments that I will not pretend he was entirely thrilled about. Theo drove down as soon as I called him that first evening. He sat with his parents while I finished my shift, and then he came and found me in the break room around 11 p.m., and we stood in the hallway for a while without saying much. He asked me a lot of questions about you, Theo said, while you were with other patients. What kind of questions? How long you'd been doing this? Where you trained? Whether you liked it? He paused. I think he was embarrassed. He doesn't need to be embarrassed, I said, which was partially true. He just needs to adjust. Ray called me 4 days after he got home. He apologized again, properly this time, without the context of a hospital room and a heart monitor making it feel obligatory. He said he'd thought about what he'd said at dinner, and he was ashamed of it. He said he'd spent 22 years in EMS, believing he understood emergency medicine from the outside, and he'd been confusing frustration with the system for a judgment about the people in it. I told him I'd heard worse. He laughed a little at that. We talked for almost an hour. We talked about his recovery, about what the cardiologist had told him, about the medication side effects he was already annoyed by. We talked about some cases he remembered from his paramedic years, the ones that had stayed with him. He told me about the family friend who'd had the bad ER experience, the real story, this time with more nuance than the version he'd delivered at dinner. It was still a legitimate grievance. The system had failed that family in a real way. But it wasn't, I pointed out gently, the whole story of what emergency medicine is. He said he was starting to understand that. The Sunday before his first cardiology follow-up, Theo and I drove down to Tucson again. Linda made chicken tortilla soup and cornbread. Bree was home for the weekend and spent most of dinner on her phone, which is the most normal thing in the world. Ray looked better, more color in his face, less of that gray around the edges that had scared me a little when he'd walked into my ER. After dinner, he and I sat on the back porch while Theo helped his mom clean up. Arizona evenings in spring are extraordinary if you've never been. The air cools fast, and the sky goes these colors that still get me even after years of living here. Ray asked me what made someone go into emergency medicine specifically, not just medicine, but the ER. I've thought about it. I like not knowing what's coming, I said. Every shift, the doors open and it could be anything. Some people hate that. I find it clarifying. He considered this. That's how I felt about the job, he said. Every call, you don't know until you know. Yeah, I said, exactly. We sat there for a while without talking, which felt comfortable in a way it hadn't 3 weeks earlier. He's going to walk me down the aisle with Theo's dad on the other side. That's what Theo and I decided, what my future in-laws decided together, actually. Which meant more to me than I expected. Ray has another cardiology appointment next month. He is, against all odds, following the dietary guidelines. Linda texts me occasionally when he tries to sneak extra salt on things, which I'm choosing to find endearing. I don't need him to be my biggest fan. I don't need him to tell every person he meets that his future daughter-in-law is an ER doctor, though apparently he has done that more than once, in ways that Theo finds slightly mortifying and I find quietly satisfying. I just needed him to look at me and see what was actually there. It took a stent and the 2-night hospital stay to make that happen, which is not how I would have scripted it. But then again, the best cases I've ever worked were the ones that didn't go how anyone expected. You adjust, you read the room, you figure out what the moment actually needs. After 11 years in emergency medicine, that part I'm pretty good at. I keep thinking about the look on Ray's face when he saw me walk around that curtain. Not shame, not quite. Something quieter than that. The specific expression of a person who has just realized the gap between what they assumed and what was actually true, and that the gap is entirely their own making. I've thought a lot about what caused that dinner conversation to go the way it did. Not Ray's fault entirely, not mine, not Theo's, though all three of us made choices that night that I wouldn't make again. Ray brought his certainty to the table without questioning it. Theo brought his avoidance. I brought my willingness to stay small to keep the peace. None of those things were neutral. All of them had consequences. That's the part that stays with me. Not the dramatic moment in the ER, not the apology on the back porch. It's the quieter understanding that how we show up, in small moments, at dinner tables, and the choices we make about what to say and what to leave unsaid, tends to come back around, not as punishment, just as result. Ray spent 22 years building his understanding of emergency medicine from the outside of the doors, and that was real experience, hard-won experience, worth respecting. But somewhere along the way that experience had calcified into a verdict, and verdicts don't leave much room for anything new to get in. I've had to check myself for the same thing. 11 years in emergency medicine can do that to you, make you confident in ways that blur into arrogance if you're not paying attention. I like to think I'm a good listener. I like to think I take in new information when I encounter it. But I also know that I made assumptions that night about what kind of man Ray was. And I made the choice to stay quiet rather than engage honestly. And neither of those things was entirely virtuous either. Staying silent to keep peace isn't always wisdom. Sometimes it's just a different form of avoidance. What I didn't expect was how much I'd end up respecting Ray once he had the chance to actually be himself. Not the version performing authority at his own kitchen table, but the man sitting on an exam table pressing one hand to his sternum, reciting his symptom onset time with the calm precision of someone who had spent decades in emergency situations. That man I understood immediately. That man I like. There's something I've learned about being in a field that requires you to keep learning, and medicine is absolutely that. Every shift, without exception. The people who last, the ones who actually get better over time rather than just more efficient, are the ones who stay genuinely curious, who can hold their expertise and their uncertainty in the same hand without dropping either one. That's not something you arrive at. It's something you practice, sometimes badly, for a long time. Ray is practicing it now. He sends me articles occasionally, things he's read about cardiac rehab, about ER triage processes, about a study on EMS response times he found interesting. He sends them without commentary, just the link. I write back with a sentence or two. It's a small thing, but it's a real thing. Theo told me recently that his dad mentioned me to a neighbor who was asking about finding a good emergency physician. He said it without editorializing, but I could hear what was underneath it. That's enough. That's actually more than enough. I didn't need Ray's approval to do my job. I didn't need his validation to know what I'd built over 11 years of overnight shifts and hard calls and patients who came in not wanting to make a fuss. But I did need, I think we all need, if we're honest, to be seen accurately by the people who are going to be our family. Not celebrated, not put on a pedestal, just seen. It took a heart attack and 2 nights in a hospital room to get there. But we got there. And the sour cherry pie at the next dinner was just as good as the first time.